absolutely. So definitely this is the dream application that you're going to be turning in. So, we haven't done scoping yet, right? This is mostly to get your feet wet, but also just to say, is this even an idea? Like if you're having trouble giving me your elevator pitch for your application, then either the app's not exciting and maybe keep thinking, but again, I won't preclude you from doing an app just because it's something that you want to do. For example, I've had students in the past whose parents or family members have owned businesses, and those businesses were like, hey, I could really use an app. One was for a restaurant. The other was for, I don't remember, something with accounting, but there was something with receipts. And so if I was to come up to you in a party and say, download my app, it's an app for my parents or for my family, that obviously doesn't work. But you can still do it and just kind of shoehorn it into this if you would. Either pretend that it's for everybody, for any accounting business, any restaurant, anything like that. And then, of course, you can tailor it to that particular restaurant and or business or whatever. So, again, I don't want to preclude you from doing an app solely for personal reasons, but yeah. So your elevator pitch, again, just a 30-second why I should care about it. And then if your app, like your stretch goals and those types of higher level stuff, if that's part of your pitch, then include it. And so if you guys have already put in the legwork for the other assignments, you can just copy and paste a lot of these items in here. Now, some of you didn't know what you were building, and that's okay. But yeah, so think about it. Take about a week to figure it out. Take the weekend. Take the next weekend. And then this will be due October 1st, which is not next Tuesday, obviously, but the Tuesday after that. So plenty of time. Think about it. Take a notebook. Write down random ideas that you have, even if they're silly. Come back to them when you really need to and say, okay, which one out of these 20 that I came up with am I going to do? And so you could even go up on the App Store and just search for things and see what's out there and say, well, I searched for, a keto diet fitness trainer, and there was a recipe app, and there was a bodybuilding one, but there wasn't anything in between. So I'm going to go ahead and that sparked an idea for me, and I'm going to go ahead and build that. So try to get ideas. You can go on Pinterest. Just search random topics and add either app at the end or something like that. Just see what's out there. See what sparks ideas. As you're reading, as you're watching, Netflix or something, you can say, hey, there'd be a cool app for avoiding, if anybody's seen Bird Box, creating an app that protects you from those demon things that are, if you haven't watched the movie. Not spoiling anything, but it's crazy. Anyway, ideas can come from anywhere.
Quick question. For naming your app,
naming the app,
a shorthanded version of I guess the category you're applying it to, for example, financial independence. A lot of people refer to it as FIRE.
Yep.
What's better to name it for the full name, or because I feel like if you name it the shorthanded version, you're kind of excluding people who are familiar with the category. But if you name it, if you name it the full thing, it's too long and kind of looks gross. I don't know.
Yeah, so a couple points in your app name. One is, we didn't get down to number 5 yet, but keywords. So keywords allow you to put in key phrases that somebody would search on. So if they're searching on FIRE, F-I-R-E, then certainly that would be a keyword. However, in your description, which is number 3 there, Apple does not index your description for keywords. So the only places that Apple will actually allow users to search on in terms of keywords and things is your app title and the keywords. So in terms of your app title, which is what your question was, I would name it what you want to call it. So let's just say for some reason, you wanted to call it, I just made this up, Common Sense. And nobody's going to search on that, right? Nobody's going to search on that, especially Spence, but what you could do is put a hyphen after that and do financial independence calculator, whatever, and then the keywords. That's one reason why for number 2, I think Apple has shortened that requirement, because that's what people used to do, is they would have like basically a paragraph within their title. So I don't remember what they shortened it to. It might even be 30 characters now. I remember something of that nature, but I didn't double check before doing this. But doesn't matter. Just give me a title, as short as you can. But this is a common practice. But again, I think Apple has kind of refrained from allowing people to do that. But I would pick a brand name that somebody's going to remember over keywords, and I would put that in your keywords. But yeah, there's pros and cons to both. If you have a real short app name, then one, it's easy to remember. It's easy to give people at parties, hey, I have an app. It's called, one I created a long time ago was Boise's Most Wanted. That's easy to remember. Somebody can go home and be like, what was that app called? Oh, yeah, Boise's Most Wanted. It's not on the App Store, unfortunately, anymore. But yeah, so easy to remember. It's Boise, so the keyword, if anybody's literally searching Boise in the App Store to see what's in there, that might come up. Anyway, yeah, okay, so the app description, the 3 sketches, and then that's same as the previous assignment. Keywords, Apple allows up to 100 characters. That includes commas and spaces, which is kind of weird, but it's just a free form. So you do like keyword number 1, comma, and then no space, keyword number 2, comma, no space, keyword number 3, etc. And in terms of combinations, generally you don't need to put in, like if you're doing, I don't know, can't think of a good example, but like let's say money as a keyword, you don't necessarily need to do case sensitivity, but you wouldn't need to do like money and then like monies. Again, that's a terrible example, but you don't need to do pluralization unless whatever's more common, just choose that. And there's a bunch of app strategies, what they call, what is it called? I was going to say app SEO, but that's, yeah, App Store SEO, App Store. I think there's a better name for it, but App Store SEO or search engine optimization for the app stores. But yeah, you basically just get the keywords and then the title for people searching your app. So if you're typing in, well, I don't know, but yeah, so that's what that is. And then give me the category of your app. Is it productive? Is it a utility? Is it educational? Is it a direction? And you can go look up the categories if you want specific ones, but just kind of list what that is. And just stick all those into a PDF as a document, write it up, and you'll get graded on that. And then, of course, above and beyond is always good. So these are just all the bullet points. Any questions? Yes.
What types of things would you consider above and beyond? Just because like that seems like a pretty yeah.
You think so?
Seems like it.
Might seem like it.
Aside from like including extra sketches or something like that.
Sure. Yeah, that's something. Thank you. Yeah. And one of the reasons I did delay this, I did want you to think about it more, but also I want to give you all your homework or your assignment 2 and 3 grades back on the other stuff before. Just kind of know where you're at and know whether the stuff that you did add was enough to get you those 20 points back, or it wasn't quite enough and maybe you just missed the mark. You got 95, you got 90. I don't think anybody got below a 95 yet on assignment 2. Hopefully be wrapping those up soon so that you get their homework 3s. Yeah, but any other questions on this? Pretty simple. And if you just don't have an idea, let me know. Hit me up on a Discord channel. We can talk about it. And what I would recommend is find something that you're passionate about. Whatever your hobbies are, do that. If you guys are board game players, create a one that either keeps track of the scores, or like especially if it's a Dungeons and Dragons type thing where you have all these stats and even rolling a 20-sided die. You can build that into the app and maybe have some kind of animation, 3D stuff like and then it stops on a number, or just make up a number on the die, right? Because I actually read a book recently about why there are certain die, like there's pyramids, there's like the diamond-shaped ones, but there's no like certain dies, like with faces, they're not balanced and things like that. So that was kind of an interesting book, but that's not what the book was on. But there are reasons why there's no like 7-sided die. However, if that's something that you need in a board game, build it into a mobile app and do that randomly. Just say choose a number between 0 and 7, or even a number between 1 and 13, or whatever. You can build a pretty complex dice rolling app. So anyway, that would be something that's based off of your hobby, something that you know about, something you're passionate about, and go from there. And literally, it doesn't have to be like the world's best app in terms of Dungeons and Dragons or whatever game you choose. But again, start there. If you're into scuba diving, then you do one that calculates your nitrogen toxicity or oxygen toxicity. Or if you're a rock climber, you can use, we'll talk about this in a couple weeks, but GPS. And as you're walking up to crags that you don't know, it's like I want to go to this crag and it's a really hard route, but I don't know how to actually get there. And once I'm there, I see this huge rock wall and I don't know where the route is. Is it 10 feet over that way? Using GPS, you'd be like, okay, should be right here. Okay, now I can see it, kind of thing. Anyway, just some ideas. But again, if you just can't think of any ideas, hit me up. I'll help you out. Can usually come up with some ideas once I get to know you guys. Or you know yourself. Okay. Let me see here. Didn't close all my tabs before. All right, so I need this guy and this guy. All right, we're about to start the live stream. Hopefully this just works. We shall give it a second. All right, so it looks like it is starting. Cool. So today, as I mentioned, we are going to talk about CoocaPods. So there are a couple of these dependency managers. So dependencies are anything that your application depends on. If you are including a third-party library, that application depends on that third-party library. And they make this a little bit bigger. Oh, that's my text field. I meant iTerminal. And we'll start there. All right. So just to introduce you to what CoocaPods are, as I mentioned, there are several other libraries, or other dependency managers. CoocaPods is by far my favorite. However, I do also like Carthage. Carthage is a little less intrusive. It doesn't actually write any changes to your project file, so people like that a little bit better. I'll show you what CoocaPods is. If you don't understand it, it's fine. We'll go through it. And then there's another one. Actually, there's probably like 3 or 4 more. But we'll start with this one, and then if you want to take what you've learned today and go and research the other ones, that's great. So the only thing I won't cover today is the install process. It's pretty simple if you have your Ruby gem installer installed already. You can get this through Homebrew or anything like that. But this is the command line command to install it. So sudo gem install CoocaPods. And once you install that, you can run the pod command line installer. They also have a GUI to administer it, but honestly, there's 2 commands that you need. So we'll get to that in a second, but I want to show you what CoocaPods allows us to do. So there's this nice, when you go to CoocaPods.org, there is a nice search interface. And let me just hit up on the chat. We got some people on chat. Now that I have live stream working, I'm excited. All right, so usually simpler is better. Search allows us, well, to search. But maybe you don't know what you want to search, so you can type in a lot of different things in here. Like if you type in web services, or better yet, maybe you're just more familiar with the concept of REST, you can see there are more than I can count, and I don't know if it's listed here, but REST-Kit, REST Essentials, RESTifier, RESTCOM, RESTless, REST-GoT Core, REST-GoT. Yeah, I don't know what half of these, actually, I don't know what any of these are, to be honest with you. But what you can do is, one, you can look at the version number. So this is a really good indication whether it's a stable release. And then obviously the description below that. So REST-Kit sounds nice, kind of like the Apple naming of things like MapKit and UI-Kit, those sort of things. So REST-Kit is a framework for consuming and modeling RESTful web services on iOS and Android, OS 10, or Mac OS that it's known. But it's 0.27.3. So obviously there's at least 27 minor releases and then 3 patches on those on that particular minor release, but it's not a 1.0 yet. So I would, if I'm really desperate, maybe I'll click on it and see what it is. But yeah, I would probably find something right now. RESTifier is in version 5. It's in Alpha 4. There's probably a version 4 that you can download, but at least that says to me that it's a little bit more mature and I could go ahead and look at it. So the one that we're going to look at, Alamo, if I can spell Alamo Fire, so kind of the same deal. Alamo Fire, it's in version 5.0. It's in beta 6, so beta is obviously a little bit more stable than alpha. However, beta is still considered unstable. But let's say my friend told me about Alamo Fire, I should really check it out. And so what do? Well, 5.0 isn't out yet, so the current stable version is 4. But the nice thing about CoocaPods is it lists the GitHub documentation for it, and we'll go to the GitHub page in a second here. But I really like libraries that take time to document their functionality, right? Because you try to use a library that doesn't have any functionality, and it's more frustrating, and you probably could have wrote it yourself than having to read through the documentation. So I always like ones that have really good documentation, and then especially how to use it. So if we scroll down far enough, I don't think they put it in here, but they do link in here. I'm not going to find it, but they do link to how to actually use the library somewhere in here. Anyway, as I said, I won't find it, but you can see that there's the current version, because 5 is in beta, that 4 would be the stable version. So,
so it's like a function library? Or
yeah, it has a whole bunch of functionality to it.
Say that again?
Has a whole bunch of functionality included in it. And I'm trying to find the install, but okay, so actually technically there's a release candidate on it. This is the command that we'll put into our CoocaPods file to allow CoocaPods to add the dependency. So we're basically saying our project depends on Alamo Fire, and then there's a bunch of fancy syntax, but really just know that we're declaring a pod. You can think about it as a Docker container if you're familiar with those, or just kind of a wrapper for this library, kind of a self-contained thing. So this particular pod or dependency is called Alamo Fire, and this little arrow with the version number is going to say that we are going to depend on version 5.0. And this is really nice because as our dependency changes, as they update Alamo Fire, so if you're using version 4, for example, and they update to 5, that your project doesn't get updated with 5 because the API has changed, right? Because a major version, and this is usually how APIs are designed, is when you have a major change like this from 4 to 5, you have breaking API changes, which means stuff that I programmed in Alamo Fire, for example, for version 4 will not work with 5. Maybe some things work and some things don't, but that's usually what the major version number means, is I broke stuff, and don't upgrade till 5 until you know how to do that. And again, with the documentation for Alamo Fire, if you scroll down far enough, somewhere, I saw it. Just gonna type it in, migration guides. Doesn't work. There we go. I don't know why that link doesn't work, but you can see there's a 4.0 migration guide, and then if you're going to upgrade from 4 to 5, there is a guide. However, it hasn't been written, so as they say, here be dragons, right? Beware. So that's kind of what I look at when I look at different libraries and what I want to add to my own projects. The more dependencies you have, the more dependent you are on other people's code, right? That's just an intrinsic property of that. But again, if you're looking at this saying, oh, I can make chainable requests, I can do URL, JSON, plist parameter encoding, which we'll get to actually maybe at the end of class if we have time. Uploading a file. So if you're ever curious about how to upload a file from iOS to a server, you can do that with Alamo Fire. Of course, you can do it with the built-in Apple libraries, but again, we don't want to have to write all that stuff from scratch. So you can read the rest of the stuff. Most of this you probably won't use, like TLS, certificate and public key pinning. But yeah, it's there if you need it. Curl stuff, curl command outputs, kind of nice if you're trying to build stuff and you don't necessarily have good documentation on the server side stuff. If you guys have ever used Postman and you get usually your backend developer will give you a curl request, and we won't get too much into that. But Alamo Fire, really good for just making a request on a server and saying, hey, server, give me back stuff, or server, here is stuff. So those are called RESTful calls, and that's Alamo Fire. Now the next thing I want to check, this looks pretty good to me, is if I go to the GitHub repository. So you can see that underneath here is essentially everything that was on the CoocaPods file. So if you actually want to create your own CoocaPod, it's very easy to do. Create a repo and put some documentation into it, and then just tell CoocaPods there's a link to it. The other thing I want to check, and this is always good for no matter whether you're doing mobile development, Java backend development with Spring and yada, 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 but to always check out the number of issues of any dependency you're going to add to your project. So click on Issues in any GitHub project, and you can look at the issues that are currently outstanding. Now, if there's something that pops up or that you need, so you're looking to use Alamo Fire for, I don't know, let's read some of these, curl generation. It's like, I need it for curl generation. I'm just making stuff up. But you see that there's an open issue. It was opened August 22nd, 2017, which tells me one of two things. One, they might not ever fix this bug. And if I'm reliant on that particular property, it might not ever get updated. But the nice thing about open source, as you all know, is you can fix it yourself, right? And then do a pull request, pull requests, say, hey, I fixed this bug, here's some documentation on it, yada, yada, and then they might merge it into their request. So that's another thing I look at is, in this particular repository, out of 2,158 issues that other developers, such as myself, have said, hey, there's a bug in your code, that they've closed those, and there's only 20 outstanding open issues on this library. So this is actually a really solid, high-end library, at least in my opinion. And you can look at the other stuff. It has 178 contributors. So this tells me, again, that this is going to be likely updated as we go. Of course, they're coming out with the version 5.0. But you can also see how long ago it's last updated, when the last commit was updated. So 10 days ago was the latest commit. So again, this is all information that tells me that this is a high quality library, and including it in my own project. If next year Apple comes out with Swift 6.0, these guys will probably be on top of it within a couple of months so that I can upgrade all of my project. But again, if you have libraries that lag behind, that are still on Objective-C, which is not a big deal, but let's say they're on Swift 1.0 and they won't update it, well, you can't update your project as a whole. You have to make all these different exceptions within your project to say, okay, compile this library under a different version of Swift. But as we move on in our lives and Apple deprecates Swift 1.0, 2.0, etc., I think we can go back to 3.0 that, we're going to be left behind and not be able to update our projects. And that really sucks, right? Like, we're dependent on somebody else to update our own projects. So do be careful of this, which is why I've taken a bit of time to explain this. And I guess I should have made this a little bit bigger so you can probably see what I'm doing. Okay, so let's decide we want something to easily download some information from a web server, whether that's Firebase, even though Firebase has its own library, or it's a Node.js server, which if you guys want, I could set one up really quickly, not today, but I can do all that full stack stuff for you. If you want to see that, if that's helpful for you, just let me know. We'll prepare a lesson on it, but that's all stuff I really enjoy doing. So anyway, so we need that. And then let's just make stuff up. I'm going to do CoocaPods.org. And the other one that we have talked about here in passing is the Swifty JSON. And I have a whole list. I won't be able to think off any at the top of my head, but I have a whole list of ones I've used in the past that I really, really like. This is one of them. So if you guys have ever started this, and I know some of you have, where you're trying to download a JSON file, what you have to do is you have to get some particular element in the JSON file and then ask it for a particular key in the JSON and then typecast it as a string, or actually as an array, no, excuse me, as a dictionary, key value pair, that's what this string /any or :any is, and then extract the value out of that and put that into a for loop and do a whole bunch of stuff. And I've done that, and it's fine, but when you get large pieces of data that either changes or is just really complex, writing this code is really, really obnoxious. Or you could do the Swifty JSON way. Sorry, that's not the Swifty JSON way, even though it is one line of code. One line of code. So they're basically saying in an if statement, and let me make this bigger so you don't have to squint. In an if statement, we're actually declaring a variable, so this is what I call the if-let clause. And what we're saying is, if this assignment is valid, if it works, it doesn't pass back nil, then go ahead and drop into this if statement and go ahead and use this username. Now, if you imagine scoping, the scoping of this value is only valid within the if statement. So it's just a nice way to initialize a variable. And if it's nil, then we drop into an else, or we just move on in our lives. But if it is valid, then we can go ahead and use it. So inside of that if statement, we can go ahead and use that value. And we don't have to do anything like unwrapping optionals and fun things like that for that particular value. All right, so yeah, Swifty JSON, just pass it in there, pass in the data, the raw data from the network, pass it into this function called JSON, and then you get this object, and you can just use it as either an array or a dictionary, depending upon what it is. So again, we're taking what could potentially be, this is kind of a simple example, but I've had ones that are like 6 lines because you have to extract a value, but then there's a sub-value, and then you have to check to see what type it is before you do check it out. So it could get quite lengthy, but anyway, we're going from, let's say, 2 to 4 lines of code to just 1 line of code. So this is the library that really helps you. And not only that is, we didn't do any type checking. So we've had to do multiple type checks on here. And if we get the type check wrong, it crashes. But this one does all that fun stuff for you. Anyway, we're gonna go ahead and use it. So to use it, usually there's some documentation in here to manually install it. And let me just type in pod space. There we go. And here's the line of code. I'll show you where we put this in a second. But pod and then Swifty JSON. Okay, and then it's going to use 4.0. This syntax gets really complicated. Like if I want to be able to use any version of 4.0, like if they upgrade it to 4.1, then you can also use that as well. And you'll just take all the updates that they get as they come in, which is really nice. But again, those 5.0, if they ever released a version 5.0, that would break your API. So let's go ahead and start a new project, and I'll show you how all this works and why we would even go ahead and do any of this stuff. So create new project. And if anybody is at home on the live stream, feel free to stop me and ask questions. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat. It got really dark in here. All right, so let's go ahead and start our project name. I'm just going to call this CoocaPods. And everything looks good here. And hit next, and I'm going to put that into our example repo. Oh, make sure as you start creating new projects in your repository that this is unchecked, because if you're putting a Git repository in a Git repository, things get a little interesting. You can do it, but unless you know what you're doing, it gets really confusing because there's two repositories that you have to actually commit to. And, that was actually the old way that we would do dependencies, is we would grab the GitHub repository and pull it into our existing repository, but then we'd have to do a pull and merge and all that fun stuff if we ever needed to update it. So CoocaPods just does all that all automatically, so it's really, really nice. All right, so I've created the project, and I'm going to instantly just close it. Yay! Let's see, where am I on here? So a quick tip, I'm going to go to, and I lost all my favorites. That's awesome. It's okay. Get back here. So in my example code, I have this one called CoocaPods. All right, so I want to change directory to this. I'm just going to click on the folder up here and then drag that in, and it gives me the location of that file. So I don't have to do all that fun typing. Do that again. Okay. So change directory. So CD. Sorry, I thought I made that bigger.
No, like how did you get there?
Yeah. I'll get that in a second. Yeah, I was trying to make my text bigger so you could see everything. All right. So CD, change directory, space, and then go back to your Finder. I navigated to my Finder. Usually I have shortcuts up here, but macOS decided to change it. So up here in the top of your Finder window, I navigated to the folder, click and drag, or excuse me, click and hold, then drag. So you should see this little tiny icon below my mouse, and just drag it into your terminal. You could drag it into any text editor, and it'll put all the folder information in there. Also, if you have any spaces, it escapes it. So really, really useful, because otherwise I'd have to type all that stuff out, and that's obnoxious. So.
Where does Apple have the command line interface?
Oh, so if you hit Command Space and just type in terminal, there's the terminal app. I have another terminal app called iTerm 2 specifically. So it's just a fancier version of the terminal, but they both work pretty much the same, or at least on the basic level. So Command Space to pull up the Spotlight app, which is my cool. Yeah, glad you guys like that. iTerm 2, yes, I'm using iTerm 2. Question on the live stream. So yeah, iTerm 2, you can see up in the top right-hand corner. It's a free application. I recommend using it if you use any kind of command line stuff. So again, you can get a graphical user interface or a GUI or a GUI for CoocaPods, but again, we're really just going to do two commands. So again, after you install it, you can just type in pod, and it should give you a whole bunch of usage on how to use pods. And in here, we're going to use just these two, init and install. So we're going to initialize CoocaPods, and then we're going to install the CoocaPods that we list in our dependency file. So I'll show you how that works. So pod init, as long as I'm in the same directory as the Xcode project file, which I am, because I did that little shortcut. So CoocaPods that command is going to look for this file. And once it does that, it creates a pod file with no extension. So you can either drag that into Xcode and edit it, which you can do later, but I'm just going to right-click and then go to my favorite text editor, Sublime Text. I don't know why it has a build number next to it, but I think that's the one I want. Alrighty, so here we go. Let me pull this off. And a bunch of zip codey thingies there. Okay. All right, so the target is going to correspond with the target in our project. So if we ever change the name of our application, we actually have to change the target here, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But underneath this comment, which is the £, or the hashtag.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm just like 10 steps behind. Don't know what you have opened up.
Oh, just text
don't know
editor.
what we're doing.
That's fine. So we're trying to add a dependency to our project, namely this the library Swifty.json. And then this is just going to help us add functionality to our app. So I want to add all this code that goes along with this Git repository. I think it'll make more sense as I go.
Which file did you drag into your terminal?
That was just the Finder window at the top here. It says CoocaPods only because that was the project name. If I right-click on it, you can see
So
folder structure here. So just in our repository CoocaPods. This guy at the top. Just to give me that long string that I didn't have to type in.
yeah, I don't know where that is in my computer.
Terminal?
I got the terminal part.
Okay. Well, it's so I just created a Xcode project, and then that's the directory that I want to navigate to in my terminal.
And that's what you named your project.
Yeah, I just happen to name it CoocaPods, which I probably shouldn't have done in hindsight because, again, collision.
So once you're in this directory, how do you get the pod file to?
So once I navigate to so I navigated into that folder in terminal, and then I just did a pod in it, and basically all it did was create that pod file for me. So I think technically, I don't think it does anything else under the hood as far as I know. So you could probably create that file from scratch. The only thing it does do is, if I go back to the text editor, it just puts in some boilerplate code, namely the target that the Xcode project is in, and then use framework pound or bang, I guess, and then end. So just a bunch of code that I'd have to type in manually. So that's what that does, is create that pod file for me. In the meantime, let me go ahead and grab that install line. I could, for the most part, just grab the name and do it, but I always like to go and get the documentation. So now you can kind of see where that file text comes from, that pod file that we've created. And all this stuff will be up on the repository, so you can see what I've done here. But between the target and the end, we're going to do pod and then Swifty.json version 4.0. And now let's go ahead and add Alamo Fire. So I'm just going to type in pod space and then, let's try version 5.0. We won't really get into the library usage today, but we'll see if we can use it out of the box. Okay, so here's this guy. Once you have your pods in your pod file, we're going to add all this code that these talented developers have added or have created and add that to my own project so I can leverage their awesome library. Again, whatever the library does for your particular project. All right, so back in my terminal, we've done pod init, which created that pod file. I've added those 2 lines of code to my pod file. Let's go back to the text file. Okay, so when I do pod install, it'll go ahead and look these up and install the libraries for me. Pod install, and that's all we have to do. Now all this documentation is, okay, compatible versions. If you install this fresh, you should probably have. Now I gotta download stuff. Maybe I shouldn't try version 5.0. Basically says, I don't know what you're talking about. Please update the CoocaPods data that it has behind the scenes. I won't go into it too much, but it's just gonna update CoocaPods here in a second. Should be done after the deltas are done.
So to drag it into the terminal, you just control click or shift click?
Click and hold for like a second, and then drag it in. Yeah, if you try to like click and drag it immediately, it'll drag the whole folder. And you can actually do that from any application that has it. So like I can right click, drop that down, or just click and hold, wait till it kind of turns gray, then I can put this anywhere I want to. And if I drag it into a text editor, it will give me the location of that, usually. Maybe not this text editor. If I drag it into the terminal, I guess it's maybe just the terminal. I've only ever used it in the terminal. Okay, so maybe I'll just delete that pod file because this is taking way too long. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that in the interest of time. So I'm just going to simply comment this out. Same idea. All right, so we're going to do pod install. I tested the Swifty.json one before, so I know. It's actually already cached too, so I don't have to re-download Swifty.json because I've already done it a little while ago, earlier today. And so it immediately just took that cached file and said, here you go, add it to the file. Okay, so what did all this do? I'm not going to make you read the text. But if we go back to our Finder, you can see it added a whole ton more files. Namely, there's our original pod file that we got from pod init. We have a pods folder, which is all of our dependencies. So if you guys have ever used gulp or grunt or what's the other dependency for JavaScript? What is it? Yes, Node Package Manager. Thank you. You would see a folder, and then if you go into that folder, you would have all the dependencies that you've listed. So yeah, Node.js has its own dependency manager, an npm Node Package, or npm, yeah, npm Node Package Manager. So you'd have like an npm folder with all those JavaScript dependencies and yada yada yada. So if you ever use that, this is exactly the same. All right, so you can see that there's a pods project. There's Swifty.json. It has all the source code that you can look up on Swifty.json, which isn't too much, but I wouldn't want to have to write that myself, right? We're going to leverage all of Swifty.json's functionality. The major change now, if we go back up to our project level, is if I try to run my original Xcode project that I created, it wouldn't work, or it wouldn't at least allow us to include Swifty.json. Instead, we now have a workspace. A workspace includes multiple projects in our application. So if I go ahead and open that, you'll see nothing except for up in the top left-hand corner, we now have two projects. We have our original CoocaPods example project that I called and silly named CoocaPods. Hopefully this still works. So this is our original project, but under pods, we now have the ability to add dependencies, other projects that other people have written that we can now utilize. So here it is, Swifty.json. I can look at the code. You can see the header. You can see all the stuff that it does. It adds an extension called Swifty.json error, yada yada, on our custom error. It has a struct called JSON. You saw that in the documentation. So you can actually read the source code if you wanted to. Here's our file private, I should say, variables. So it's really nice to see how some of this stuff is constructed by professional iOS/Swift developers. Anyway, we won't dive too much into it, but again, this is how we would go about that. All right, so we just have one dependency in here. Now I'm going to go to my CoocaPods, and just like your previous application that we've been building, we have a view controller in here. And up here in the imports, if I said import, and then I wanted to add the Swifty.json stuff, there it is. So you might have seen other ways of adding dependencies. If you go up to the project files, or excuse me, the project properties, and scroll all the way down to the bottom, you can see, maybe you can't see it, it says linked frameworks and libraries, and we can actually include .framework files in here. If I hit plus, there's a bunch in here. MapKit should be in one. So I can add MapKit functionality. And this is like the really low-level way of adding frameworks, either from Apple or somewhere else. If you ever download like dynamic linked libraries and all that fun stuff. This is also how to include that. You can do embedded binaries. So again, this is how you would manually install these guys, is you'd get a compile.framework. So if I ever try to look at Apple's MapKit framework, it's all binary data. They've compiled it, they've wrapped it into a framework package, and they distribute that, and you can use the APIs, but you can't look at the code. But you can see here that there's a framework that has been added when we did the pod install called Pods, CoocaPods framework. And so under the hood, and this is kind of why I like CoocaPods over Carthage, though your opinion might differ, is because when I do the pod install, it looks and see if there's a workspace, and if there is not, then it goes ahead and adds the workspace, and then adds all these different configurations and everything like that. So yeah, a couple things on the chat. What else? Yeah, I mean, it does a whole bunch of configuration for you. So not only does it add dependencies and keep those dependencies updated, but it adds those to the projects, and so you don't really have to know too much about it, which is maybe not a good thing, but it's easy. Let's see. Okay, yeah, so Swifty.json, if you look at the documentation, I'm not going to get too much into it, but we now have the ability to do something like JSON, which is now a built-in, not a built-in type, but it's a type that we can start using and do a constructor for and see all, and because these guys have documented this, we can go and get some, so it says this creates a instance initialized to the given Boolean value. And if you go ahead and look at that, actually let's go ahead and select that. And then if you remember command click, we have all these different options. We can say show quick help. Okay, it's a struct, that's not very helpful. But if we do jump to the definition, okay, they haven't documented this particular one, but we can just jump to the documentation and see that implementation. I was going to give them credit, but no. So like this would be a public, or not a public, a function header, and this is where you'd get the documentation for it. So you can see there's a parameter, there's a return statement, and so when I go for this particular instance, if I look at the quick help, this will format it all in that nicely formatted documentation for me. Okay, so that's just command click and then show quick help. I chose a poor example, but anyway, that's their fault for not documenting their initializers. But yeah, I get all this functionality for free. So again, CoocaPods. Let me go ahead and back up a second. You can search for things like databases. Just kind of scroll through. There's a Firebase database. Talk about that in a future class. Yeah, so I have, let me write this down so I remember. There is actually a Git repository. Let me write it down first and then I'll talk. There is a repository that all it does is list really, really useful repos like this, and they're categorized. So like some are based on UI, some are based on testing, some are based on continuous integration, some are whatever you can think of, databases, and they'll just list all the really good ones in there, and it just grows, and people will do pull requests to add other libraries. Because this is kind of hit and miss. Like I type in database, and unless they've specifically put database in the title or the description, I won't find it. So you know, I don't know if there's core data is not necessarily or it's an Apple library, but it's not in here. But you can find other like core data helper and things like that. So you can look around, but that repo is really helpful.
Which in your experience is the best database to use for this stuff?
For iOS, definitely core data, just because it's Apple built. I've heard some complaints about how hard it is to use. However, you can form your own opinion when we cover it, because we'll cover it in a week or two. But it's really nice because it has a visual editor for the database schema, so you can edit your data schema visually and connect stuff and do one-to-many and inverse relationships, all that fun stuff. I don't know why it's hard, but I've been using it since 2005, so I might be a little biased in terms of, like, I've just been exposed to it. And I remember when I was learning it was complex, but I was young. Yeah, go ahead.
So I know we're kind of going off on a tangent.
Oh, no worries.
So kind of going off of that, if let's say after we make our app and I've got an app idea right now that I've got some interest from other people, like let me know when you come out with that because I want to buy that app.
Nice.
And so if kind of the idea started taking off and I'm like, oh, I want to develop an Android app. And I want to have it to where they can both access the same database for stuff. Would I want to use maybe SQL or something? Or
yeah.
probably not?
So for core data, you asked me, and I should have asked you more questions because anytime anybody asks you what's the best, right? You always ask more questions because the best for what? Core data is an embedded database, which means it only lives on your phone. It is what we call, or one of the implementations of core data is SQLite, which means it's a single user database. It's not a network database, so multiple users cannot access it at the same time. So to answer your question, if you wanted an Android app and multiple users and an iOS app with multiple users hitting the same data, you would want something that's networked on a server, such as a SQL database, MS SQL, MySQL, NoSQL, Mongo, Redis, all those fun things. I said Mongo, Redis, and Couch, and there's a bunch of NoSQL databases out there. But yeah, you'd want something more akin to that. Firebase is a great example of a NoSQL database that is just the best for a networked database. Yeah, I was primed to talk about core data when you asked me the best one. There's other ones made by Facebook that is cross-platform for Android and iOS. They're obviously different implementations, but they use basically the same idea for a database. But again, it's an embedded database. So yeah, we'll go over all that stuff when we do the core data stuff, which is, if anybody's interested, again, make sure you show up to class. October 3rd and October 8th, we'll talk about core data. And actually just general databases, because from my experience, most people in my class have no idea what a database looks like or how to even access one or anything about it. So we will cover all of that stuff. So do not worry if you have no idea what a database is or how to use it or why you'd want to use it. We'll cover all that stuff. But that's why we take 2 days for it, because core data in itself could probably be covered in one class, but if you don't know the difference between a select and a merge and a join and not a merge, a join is a merge, all that fun stuff, then we'll talk about it. Cool. Anything else? Any questions on anything? Life. Games. How to win the lottery. I have no
How do you
idea.
do that?
Good question. I'll get back to you on that one. Yes, there are some things I do not know. But yeah, so anybody on the live stream, a couple things on there. That's it. Yeah, so CoocaPods you do have to install prior to running all those commands. So if you're trying to follow along, sorry. You're probably still installing it when I ran over that stuff. Next time I'll try to preempt you and say, hey, if you want to follow along, do that stuff. But you have the live stream. It'll go up. It'll be archived. And then I got the full one where we talked about assignment 4. So if you're joining me from my class and not some random internet awesome person.
So what commands do you type into the terminal after you got the
4.
change directory into your CoocaPods file?
Yep. So 2. Pod init, INIT, and pod install after you init it, but after you add your dependencies to the file.
Command not the file.
So that means you have not installed it.
I have not installed what?
CoocaPods.
Okay, where is that going to install?
So good questions. How do you install it? Go to CoocaPods.org. Sudo gem install CoocaPods. I kind of breezed over that, so. But that's all I got for you guys. If you want to, as I said, I got the schedule pretty much open after next month. So if you have any questions, on anything, on how to do anything, we're open for discussion. And thank you everybody for joining the live stream. Question on assignment 3, okay. So the question overall is the Alma fire you just addressed the updated, I'm not addressed the JSON response as success and failure. I think version 5.0 of Alma Fire does use the updated success and failure blocks. So if you want to follow the tutorials online, change your dependency from Alma Fire 5.0 to 4 something.